Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Kartik Krishnaiyer, and I'm going to be flying solo this week because I want to talk about a place I recently discovered and visited last month in Northeast Florida, in Flagler County, that I had no idea existed and had no idea the history of. So, as well versed as I like to think I am about the state of Florida and the history of Florida, there are new things I discover all the time. And this is the Bulow Plantation Ruins State Historic Park in southern Flagler County. It's just north of the Flagler-Volusia line. And it's something that I was not aware of. And then I saw that there were Seminole War ruins in the area, and I explored them. I was in St. Augustine, actually. And I said, okay, this is something worth exploring. Didn't really know much about the Seminole War in that part of the state. Know a great deal about the Seminole War in north central Florida and on the west coast, the Dade area, Dade Battlefield area, Dade City area. And then, of course, southeast Florida. We've done a whole series of videos and podcasts on the battles in southeast Florida, particularly the Battle of the Loxahatchee River and the Battle of Jupiter Inlet, right, in what is now St. Lucie, Martin, Palm Beach counties. So this was really interesting, and it's actually got a much deeper history than I thought. In 1821, Charles William Bulow purchased and began to develop a plantation area along the banks of a tributary creek of the Halifax River. But between 1823 and 1836, when the Seminoles burnt the plantation in the Seminole War, Bulow was maybe the largest slave-driven sugar plantation in the American territory of Florida, which had just been purchased from the Spanish and became American in 1821. Remember, the Spanish had East Florida and West Florida. We've done plenty of podcasts and written articles about that division. So this is really something that affected the old areas of East Florida. Sugar plantation and milling took off in East Florida towards the end of the Spanish period, the 18 teens, after the Patriots War, which we've done a podcast on, but really, really took off after 1821, when Florida became a U.S. territory. And there has been a hope that Florida could produce sugar for the United States like Louisiana did, right, in that quantity at the time. There were about 12 sugar plantations between St. Augustine and Cape Canaveral, and Bulowville, the Bulow Plantation, Bulowville was the probably the largest and the wealthiest. The Bulow Sugar Mill was the largest sugar mill in Florida at the time. It was operated by Charles Wilhelm Bulow, Major Bulow, who we talked about a minute ago, and his son John Bulow from 1821 until it was burned by the Seminoles in 1836. More on that in a little bit. Sugarcane was planted in January and February and was ready for harvesting by mid-October. Field workers cut the cane and loaded it on wagons that brought it to the mill for processing. And I'll have some pictures of the mill, the ruins of the mill, on the Florida Squeeze website, as well as doing a couple of videos for the Florida Squeeze's YouTube page and Florida History Podcast in the near future. But the ruins are really impressive. The energy behind Bulow Sugar Mill required, just like any mine, a lot of energy. Sugar mills were largely operated in this period by animal power. Horses or oxen turned the gears that moved the large rollers used to crush sugar cane, or the cane that had sugar in it. By the time the sugar mill was built, steam-powered mills were becoming available. The sugar mill at Bulow Plantation. These provided greater power and allowed cane to be processed much faster. So from 1821 to 1830 or so, there was animal-powered mills. But then in 1831, there became a steam-powered mill, which, of course, required a lot of slave labor, unfortunately. So the building the boiling room, the building right by the mill, and then the engine house that was right there, carried steam from the building to the second floor of the sugar house, where a large 3-roller cane press was located. So that was all done by slave labor, and there was the boiler and machinery. You can see the ruins of this. There was a sawmill that you can see ruins of there, which were quite interesting. Built in January of 1831. Now there was also on the plantation grown cotton, corn, rice, vegetables, other vegetables, and indigo. Livestock and game were provided for the slaves to feed them and for the family, for the Bulow family. And what was the other staple of a slave diet was cornmeal and various aspects of things made from cornmeal. And slaves were on this plantation reportedly also taught how to hunt and fish and find their own food. Cane juice was produced from this plantation as well, which allowed more revenue to come in. And kettles were set up, and the juice flowed from the kettles and flowed into a large wooden cooling vats to harden. And then that allowed you to create sugarcane juice and sugarcane for table consumption. Moving sugar cane and sugar juice, cane juice and molasses and all of these byproducts to market was another whole process. The tributary of the Halifax River, which became named Bulow Creek and is still named Bulow Creek after the Bulow family and the Bulow Plantation, was the transportation, was the highway, the transportation where you would have boats transport the product, the sugar and the molasses, down the creek to the Halifax River and into Mosquito Inlet, which is now Ponce de Leon Inlet, for workers to load them onto boats bound for Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Savannah. And they would go to market in Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Savannah at the time. Now, Daytona Beach didn't exist. Daytona Beach is actually much closer to where this plantation was than St. Augustine was. St. Augustine, Jacksonville, or Savannah. And also keep in mind New Smyrna, which had existed and had been settled at one point, very, very critical settlement for the British in East Florida that we've done a whole podcast on, which was abandoned in 1775, 1776, that period during the American Revolutionary War. And the residents of New Smyrna, the ones that were still alive, which were a significant number of people who were in New Smyrna, as we've talked about, colonists and workers, had passed away. They moved the Menorcans in particular to St. Augustine. So there's no New Smyrna at this point. It's gone. It'll be resettled soon, but it's not there. There's no Daytona Beach. There's no Palm Coast. That's many, many years later. That's a fairly new town. So St. Augustine was the closest place. So you had to slip down the Halifax River, so kind of south to where Ormond Beach is now. Ormond Beach, Holly Hill, Daytona, that area, and then ship up to St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Savannah. Now, like all large slave-driven plantations of that era, the Bulow Plantation was self-sufficient. It was a self-contained city, effectively, or village, where the products that came from the plantation were absolutely positively byproducts of slave labor. There's no two ways about it. The place doesn't exist without enslaved Africans, and that's a real sad part of Florida's history when you also consider, as we've talked about repeatedly on this podcast, and this is where I have problems with the kind of uniform look at the south of what is now the southern United States that you get from things like the 1619 Project, etc. Florida has a very different origin story and growth story than the rest of what is now the southern United States. And in fact, you had thriving free African American communities in Florida, and you had free African Americans contributing to the defense of Florida in some of the most valiant ways, both when Florida was a Spanish colony and when Florida was a British colony. Now, of course, once Florida falls into the hands of the United States, it becomes like any other part of the southern United States, very slave labor driven and very, very racist. So the Florida prior to 1820 has a very different composition, very different attitude towards race, etc., than the colonies immediately to the north and west of us. Now, again, it wasn't egalitarian in any way. I don't want to leave listeners with that impression. But it was not as overtly and dramatically racist and slave-driven as South Carolina, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi end up being, Louisiana end up being. It was very different. So anyway, that's how Bulowville developed. And in fact, John James Audubon, this is an important story before we get to talking about the Seminole War and what happened to the plantation. Audubon visited the plantation in 1834, and he drew birds, some very unique because, again, you didn't get the same sort of bird life in Florida that you did in many of the other places he would have visited that were part of the United States. So he stayed in the guest house, and then he stayed in the great house, too, with John Bulow, who by this time had inherited the plantation completely from his father, young John Bulow, who was then in his 20s. Some beautiful drawings of birds, fishing in the swamps, etc., from Bulow Plantation were sketched by John James Audubon, including Greater Yellow Lakes. And excuse me, I said 1834. 1831 is when Audubon actually visited the plantation. But then came, unfortunately, the Seminole War for John Bulow. Now, John Bulow, ironically enough, was not like other plantation owners in Florida and other settlers in Florida. He was someone who actually believed the Seminole Native Americans should not be shipped to what is now Oklahoma. He did not agree with the U.S. government policy to send the Seminoles onto reservations west of the Mississippi River. He had a peaceful coexistence with the Seminole Native Americans, and he even demonstrated his disapproval of American policy by firing a cannon toward Major Putnam's command of the state militia as they entered his property, basically saying, hey, I'm maybe not even neutral in this conflict. I understand why the Seminoles are so unhappy. And this is in December of 1835, the Dade Massacre, which we've talked about before on this podcast, and we will talk about again. We're going to do a whole series on Native Americans in Florida coming up in the near future. That had just happened in 1835. That's, of course, modern day. Dade City is in Pasco County, but I think actually the site of the Dade battlefield is in Hernando County, right, or Sumter County. But along kind of the west coast, central west coast of Florida, is where the Dade Massacre happened. So the American troops took Bulow prisoner. And then what ends up happening is the troops occupy the plantation, and Bulow ends up being relocated to St. Augustine as the troops abandon his plantation. They let him free, but the Seminoles burned down his plantation. It was approximately sometime in January of 1836. The Seminoles burned Bulowville down along with all the other plantations that were in the area. And that's why you have extensive plantation ruins in in this part of Florida, but it has not become outside of the Kingsley Plantation, and that's something we want to do. I want to do something on Kingsley himself. He's actually an interesting guy. For a slaveholder, it's all relative, but for a slaveholder, I would say Kingsley was more of a kind of enlightened Renaissance man than most white Floridians at the time. So I do want to do something on him and his plantation in the future on this podcast. But the Seminoles burned most of the rest of the plantations in the area. I think you can pretty much understand why. And Bulow is stuck without a plantation in his mid-20s, living in St. Augustine, and he passes away soon thereafter. But the ruins are still there for us to see, and it was really, really fascinating for me to see the ruins, the Coquina ruins. I should have mentioned the sugar mill was built at Coquina, like so much in that part of Florida is. The sugar mill, several wells are there, the spring house, the mansion, the kind of the foundation of the mansion you can see, although the house is gone, and it's heartening to see, just from my own personal worldview, that the forest reclaimed the area around the plantations as nature intended and as it had been when the Seminoles themselves inhabited the land and before they had been pushed out by white settlers. So Bulow Plantation is actually next to Bulow River State Park, which is it's just south of it in Volusia County, or part of it's in Flagler. As I said, the plantation is in what is now Flagler. These political lines didn't exist at the time. It was all St. Johns County in those days. But it's actually neat to kind of take in the natural area and the plantation ruins and think about all of these things in context. So anyway, brief diversion this week on the Florida History Podcast, but talking about a place I recently discovered. I knew there were plantation ruins in that part of the state, but I had not I had not seen any of them directly and investigated the stories as to these places and spent some time. I spent a whole afternoon in that in that park, that ruins. And again, it's Bulow Plantation Ruins State Historic Park, which is in Flagler County. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you next week.